Friends, it's a special pleasure to speak to conference in the city where I had my political baptism of fire. Glasgow's a really great city, and Glaswegians are warm and hospitable and humorous. But Glasgow has experienced one party that's Labour rule for decades. I know because I was part of the Labour political machine here in the 1970s. And on one level, it worked well. Insanitary slums were razed to the ground. We built 30,000 new social homes for rent in a decade. Actually, I think 5,000 in 1 year. There was a scale unimaginable today. But there was also an unhealthy tribalism and a Tammany Hall culture in which union bosses had excessive influence in picking candidates and deciding policies. And judging by Falkirk and other Labour fiefdoms, nothing very much has changed. Now, that's one major reason why we must not concede to Labour the mantle of radical progressive politics. We must assert our ownership of that tradition, which in Scotland runs for over a century, from Asquith, Gladstone, Campbell Bannerman, through to Joe Grimond, David Steele, Charles Kennedy, Bob McLennan, Ming Campbell, Jim Wallace, and many others. Now, the challenge today is to reinforce that liberal tradition, which is at risk of being compromised by working with what on Clyde's side are called the hated Tories. And that's when people are being polite. Like you, I've spent most of my political life fighting the Tories, from Glasgow to Twickenham. But despite that, I believe it was both brave and absolutely right for the party under Nick Clegg's leadership to work with the Tories in an economic emergency in the national interest. Now, Theresa May once characterised the Tories a decade ago as the nasty party, and after a few years trying to be nice and inclusive, it's reverted to type. We've got dog whistle politics orchestrated by an Australian Rottweiler. We've got hostility towards organised labour and people on benefits and immigrant minorities. And the list of people the Tories disapprove of is even longer than that. Public sector workers, especially teachers, the unmarried, people who don't own property. And I suspect that their core demographic excludes pretty much anybody who wouldn't have qualified for a vote before the 1867 Reform Act. I think these prejudices can perhaps be explained in part by their age profile. I suspect I would qualify, not on ideology, but on age, to be a member of the Young Conservatives. But I think the other reason is a deeper one, a cynical calculation that in difficult times, fear trumps hope, and that competence requires callousness. And that is not our kind of politics. It is ugly, and we will not be dragged down by it. And that's why our Liberal Democrat message about fairness is absolutely key. I think we can legitimately claim ownership of the tax policies which have lifted millions of low earners out of income tax. And remember, it is our policy. Don't let the Tories steal it. I can remember in opposition bringing this proposal to this conference at a time when George Osborne's top priority was cutting inheritance tax for millionaires. And our commitment to taxing unproductive wealth, that's valuable property, through a mansion tax, is economically sensible and popular, but above all fair. And don't let Labour steal that either. Now, fairness takes us so far, but in my view, not far enough. We're not just a nicer version of the Tories. There are fundamental differences about how we create a stronger economy and more jobs. Remember that we are 5 years on from the biggest market failure of our lifetime. Financial capitalism collapsed and was rescued by the state. Labour was in charge, and they'd fallen asleep at the wheel, and they were negligent. But the Tories' friends and donors were also at the heart of the greed and recklessness that lay behind that disaster. And today they yearn to return to business as usual. And whilst we work with them, as we have to do, pragmatically and constructively to clear up the mess, we must not allow them to turn the clock back. Now, in essence, the Tories have a very simple worldview, which is private good, public bad. And Labour offers the polar opposite. Now, as Liberal Democrats, we value both private and public sector. Now, I support, of course, private business, big and small, but I also support mutuals and employee ownership. And I don't think even Tony Benn could have claimed to have launched 2 state-owned banks. The Green Investment Bank, now based in Edinburgh, which we promised 3 years ago, has already committed $685 million to green projects. And the Business Bank, which I launched at conference exactly a year ago, is now mobilizing private capital to support new banks and local banks and non-bank finance. It is the key to stopping the suffocation of good small companies by the big banks. Now, by contrast, the Conservatives' spiritual home is the United States. They've become the Tea Party Tories. They want to throw overboard any tax or regulation that gets in the way of their blinkered small state ideology. I think deep down, they believe that there is no alternative to unhindered individual self-interest, that attempts to tackle big disparities of income and wealth must take us down the road to socialist serfdom. Now, our rejection of that dogma also leads us to an eclectic mixture of markets and regulation. Now, in government, we are rightly getting rid of the red tape that throttles small business and holds back entrepreneurs. But some regulation is essential. And that's why I work with Ed Davey to resist Tory pressure to emasculate environmental regulations, as in their ludicrous war on min bills. And it's also why we've seen off demands from a Tory donor to make it possible to fire people for no reason whatever. Now, let nobody tell you let no one tell you that Liberal Democrats have not made a difference. Without us in government, we would now be ruled by people who think that the problem with this country is that workers have too much job security. Instead, I propose to act against abusive practices in zero-hours contracts, like exclusivity arrangements, which prevent workers seeking alternatives even when they're given no work. And I've secured agreement in government to launch a formal consultation on the best mechanism to tackle this abuse. We've had to take some tough and necessary economic decisions with the Tories. And there is, of course, common ground with them on the need to cut the structural deficit and to promote private enterprise. And there is welcome sign of returning confidence in the economy. But let's not get carried away And let's not get sucked into a petty, point-scoring, Tory Labour Punch and Judy show on the economy. It took many years of mistakes to create the financial crisis. It's taken us 5 years to start to dig our way out of it. We must not now settle for a short-term spurt of growth fueled by old-fashioned property boom and bankers rediscovering their mojo. We've seen it all before, and there are already amber lights flashing, warning us of history repeating itself. Now, David Cameron says I'm a Jeremiah, but you will recall from your reading of the Old Testament that Jeremiah was right. He warned that Jerusalem would be overrun by the armies of Nebuchadnezzar. And in my own book of Lamentations, I described how Gordon Brown's New Jerusalem was overcome by an army of estate agents, property speculators, and bankers. The problem we now have is that the invaders are back. And they've got a bridgehead in London and the southeast of England, and they've got to be stopped. Instead, we need sustainable growth. And that involves rebalancing the economy across the UK in favour of exports and investment, which is the central purpose of our government's industrial strategy. And we should celebrate the success of motor vehicles and aerospace and the creative industries and educational exports and the partnership between business and government in all these areas. Manufacturing is coming back through rebuilt supply chains. We're attacking the country's scandalous neglect of skills through our successful relaunching of large-scale apprenticeships. We've given priority to Britain's world-class science, and we've created a chain of innovation centres, the so-called catapults, of which there are 2 in Glasgow, promoting new business-led technologies for advanced manufacturing and new offshore renewables. We are building a genuine cross-party consensus around these government interventions so that they endure. But make absolutely sure, no mistake, because without Liberal Democrats in government, they would never have happened. But if sustainable recovery is to be achieved, we must meet the enormous challenge of house building. Demand growth has been outstripping supply, pushing up rents and prices. Property is simply unaffordable for families without big incomes or access to the bank of mum and dad. Yet we are nowhere near recapturing the level of house building that pulled Britain out of the slump of the 1930s. Barely 100,000 homes a year are being completed. It's a quarter of what was achieved in the 1960s. In addition, 2 million social homes have been sold since Mrs. Thatcher began in 1979, and no less than 3/4 of them under Labour. Hence, the enormous pressure on families trapped by a lethal combination of low pay, rising rents, and tighter benefit rules. And the priority right now is increasing housing supply through both private and public sector. And Conference took a strong step forward this morning with the proposal to give councils greater capacity to get on and build more social housing. What the country desperately wants is delivery of homes, not a dogmatic argument about tenure. Now, I did hope that we would find some common ground with the Tories, at least in one area, which is supporting the idea of an open, outward-looking country. And indeed, we said with one voice that Britain is open for business. Sadly, that message has changed. Brazilian and other overseas students who would bring economic and wider benefits to British universities are being told that they're burdensome immigrants, so they go to the United States instead. We have Chinese tourists and businessmen who are so fed up with the hassle and the humiliation of trying to visit Britain to make investments here that they're taking their money to Germany and France instead. And what they hear is that we are closed for business, and that must change. Moreover, our status as a popular destination for job-creating investment from Japan and the United States and mainland Europe could well be compromised by careless talk from some of my coalition cabinet colleagues, and let alone the backbench bones and hollow bones, about leaving the European Union and the single market. Now, Britain's future in the European single market is now being put at risk by the Tories, yet millions of British jobs depend on protecting that relationship. Let's remember that we voted to join the present coalition. We didn't vote to join a coalition with UKIP. Now, of course, the Tories are frightened by the public reaction to overseas workers. But there is something deeply opportunistic about people who lecture our workers and the rest of Europe about the need for free and flexible labour markets, and then squawk with panic when those free and flexible labour markets bring us foreign workers. The politics of identity is toxic, and it's difficult. And at times of hardship, those outside the elite of the rich and powerful do tend to blame outsiders. And that's why we need to address the underlying problem. At present, most workers' incomes are being squeezed in real terms. And this has averted an unemployment disaster in the short run. But there is no long-term future for this country having a low-pay, low-productivity economy. We can't just, wave a magic wand and make the problem go away. But we can be more ambitious in showing the way forward. And so I've asked the Low Pay Commission to advise us how we might achieve a higher minimum wage without damaging employment. The deeper lesson here is that business has to be responsible as well as profitable. And some of you may remember that 3 years ago I spoke at conference and said in my speech that we must shine a bright light in the dark corners of capitalism. I thought at the time I was paraphrasing Adam Smith, the sage of the Scottish Enlightenment, but much of the press thought that Karl Marx had risen from his cemetery in Highgate to join the coalition government. And that was before, of course, the libel or the hacking scandal broke, and the revelation of industrial-scale tax avoidance by prominent companies. Trust has been very badly damaged. And responsible capitalism, actually, is what sensible business wants. And I've been working, therefore, with business, amongst other things, to achieve binding shareholder votes on executive pay, that's now happening, to make real progress in getting women properly represented at the top levels of business, and getting our institutional investors to think long-term. Now, Joe Swinson and I in our department have a lot more work to do to advance family-friendly working and to establish an open register of who owns what companies to help curb tax dodging. And I am now preparing to legislate to make it easier to prosecute and ban road directors who repeatedly walk away from their debts and their customers. Let me be clear that we Liberal Democrats see business as a partner, and not as an adversary in creating responsible capitalism. Now, I'd like to end as I began, in Glasgow. There is a stretch of the Maryhill Road in the north of this city that connects the ward I once represented with the constituency which Joe now represents in Parliament. And there's one thing that hasn't changed in all those years. Despite the efforts of successive UK and Scottish governments, there is an enormous gulf, a life expectancy difference of, I think, 7 years, between the prosperous and educated at one end and the seriously deprived community at the other. And I want our party to be the one that's arguing for the full unity of the United Kingdom. And unity is not just about Scotland and England, important though that is. It's also about North and South, it's about public and private, and it's about rich and poor. And in our tribally divided politics, the country badly needs the one party that can bridge these dangerous divides. It isn't just a matter of splitting the difference between other parties' policies. It's about setting out a clear and distinctive vision. This country needs a party which is competent in office, but also committed to fighting prejudice and entrenched privilege. And we are that party. Thank you.